Eleanor Roosevelt, in her 1960s book Learn by Living, wrote, "With freedom comes responsibility." That statement was as true then as it is now. Freedom of speech and freedom of expression are precious rights, and we have a responsibility to protect them. Firstly, we have a personal responsibility to use our freedom responsibly. Just because we can say a thing, it does not necessarily follow that we should say a thing. We must all take personal responsibility to measure ourselves, to make sure we speak and express feelings and ideas in a clear and constructive way, and never to abuse our freedoms. Freedom of speech does not mean freedom from consequence, nor would I ever suggest that it should be. But those consequences should be appropriate, not the current culture of cancelling ideas that don't fit with a specific narrative or calling for the heads of those that dare to give an alternative opinion. I find that increasingly disturbing because it is a real threat to freedom of speech. What type of society would we be if everyone said what they pleased any time without filter or thought? In contrast, what type of society would we be if we couldn't question, discuss or debate freely? There is clearly a difference between what is morally acceptable and what is legally acceptable. We cannot allow those definitions to be confused or intertwined. Each must stand in its own right. We also have a collective responsibility to protect our freedoms. Freedom of speech and expression is one of the cornerstones of our democracy. To remove or diminish those rights undermines the very foundation of the society that we live in. We must always be free to question and challenge any subject, whatever it may be. That isn't to say I support hate speech or racism by any stretch. I find both offensive. But to deny that those attitudes exist and try and silence those that would speak them will just drive them behind closed doors. It is far better to have all ideas and opinions out in the open where they can be challenged and debated with reason and logic. Who gets to decide what wrong speak is anyway? Who gets to play judge and jury on what we can and can't say, feel or even think? The Scottish Hate Crime Bill, for example, I believe is a particularly insidious piece of legislation, drafted with such vague crimes such as stirring up hatred, which is defined as behaving in a threatening or abusive manner, or communicating threatening or abusive material to another person. Whilst I, and I'm sure many others listening to this, fully support the principle of protecting people from prejudice, such definitions are far too vague and open to interpretation that they can be readily abused. Would it be right that J.K. Rowling could face prison time for expressing her views and concerns over trans v women's rights? Or a comedian should be prosecuted for cracking an Englishman, Scotsman and Irishman joke? Have people forgotten that we have a right to be offended? The question becomes, what type of society do we want to be? Free thinking and democratic? Or sinister and fascist? We owe it to future generations to preserve the rights we hold dear. After all, it is to them and their posterity that we commit our future.